Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of AIJAC Live Online for 2021. It's a pleasure to have you with us tonight. A special mention to our international guests as well as our Facebook audience. Thank you again for joining us. And now have a quick flip over to Israel to see Einat. Hi Einat, how are you?
Good, thank you.
It's fantastic to see you again. It's great to have you back for a new year. Heading off our webinar series. We will have another webinar next week at noon, Wednesday, the 17th of February, with Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, Danielle Pletka. Danielle is no stranger to AIJAC, as we saw her last year. She was quite popular, and we look forward to hearing her insights and predictions for the new Biden administration. You can register via the original invite that was sent last week, and a reminder email will be sent out on Thursday as well. So that's our next webinar next Wednesday, the 17th of February at noon. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as usual, tonight's session will have a Q&A. We will moderate this through the raised hand feature inside Zoom. I'll go through the instructions for that when we get to the Q&A later on tonight. Now to our main event. Dr. Einat Wilf is a former Knesset Member for Labour and the co-author of The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has Obstructed the Path to Peace. It's a fantastic book. Now, AIJAC has been able to obtain some copies for sale. You can contact the Melbourne office if you would like to purchase one of the copies that AIJAC has been able to source. If not, Ariel will put in the chat of Zoom tonight where you can purchase a hard copy from Amazon or the electronic copy as well. A fantastic book. Now, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's topic is the view from Israel, COVID, elections, and the Biden administration. I would now like to hand over to AIJAC's Executive Director, Dr. Colin Rubinstein, to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Joel, and thanks for that sleek introduction. And yes, please follow us and also support us, because without your help, our activities would be non-existent, and they're very much appreciated. So I'm delighted to welcome everyone back in 2021, and particularly delighted to welcome our very distinguished guest of honor tonight, Dr. Einat Wilf. And yes, echoing what Joel said, please buy and read an outstanding book, The War of Return. You won't regret it. It's outstanding and lays out what's happened and what needs to happen for things to improve better than any other comparable book that I know of. So much is happening in the Middle East, and in Israel, of course, elections on March 23. They're somewhat bewildering in a way, but we do know it's essentially a contest on the right between pro and anti-Bibi factions. Very fluid, to put it mildly, with corruption charges against the Prime Minister thrown into the mix as well. And secondly, of course, how Israel is grappling with COVID, waves of success, failure, and now success again. A remarkable vaccination record, but also it highlights elements of fragmentation, division within Israeli society, and lack of cohesion that are certainly worrying, along with the many strengths that we see. And of course, we have the new Biden administration at work. What's its impact on Israel and the broader Middle East? Key issues of Iran and the Abraham Accord and the future of Israel-Palestinian relations. I must say these were all items that President Biden avoided in his major foreign policy address just last Friday, and I'm sure we'll ask Einat whether that is actually a good sign or perhaps a worrying sign. We shall see. But there are those issues and many more in terms of how he deals with China and Russia and our region and Asia and Pacific as well. Einat, with her history as a former member of Knesset, her experience and knowledge of the United States, and of course her outstanding intellectual pedigree, is really uniquely placed to offer us this evening more perceptive and thoughtful, nuanced observations on all of these pressing issues, and I'm sure many more. Einat, please warm us up with your opening remarks, which I'm sure will be followed by a very interesting Q&A session. Einat, the screen is yours.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to bring together this event and COVID. Uh, as I've been doing for the last year, for a significant share of it, I've been homeschooling my kids, doing it in the morning. But today I had to postpone the beginning of homeschool due to this talk. And everything is learning opportunity. So I asked the kids if they can guess why is it that I'm giving a talk in the morning to Australia, where normally my talks are in the evening. And I'm happy to say that they figured out the reason. So this has been my life for the last year, homeschooling in the mornings and giving talks mostly in the evening and occasionally to Australia in the morning. So a bit about this year and where we're heading. One of the things that has been the most continuous aspect of foreign policy of the United States from the Obama administration to the Trump administration and now clearly to the Biden administration is what they call the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia has been the determining element of American foreign policy in the last few administrations, and it will continue to be the case. And part of it is that America is leaving the Middle East, and that is a continuous foreign policy. It hasn't changed from Obama to Trump to Biden. There is a substantial difference about how they think of leaving the Middle East, but they are all leaving. And I remember thinking when President Obama gave his pivot to Asia speech, I thought to myself, okay, we in Israel, by virtue of our history, we're stuck here. This is our region. We're not pivoting to Asia anytime soon. We are here. We're not leaving the Middle East. And as a result, this is responsible for many of the changes we're seeing in recent years. It is becoming very, very clear, if it wasn't earlier, that Israel's future is intimately tied with the region, which means that our future is tied with the Arab and Islamic world. For over a century, Israel's ability to prosper, to survive, to even be established depended on its ability to get Western support and at times Soviet support against the hostility of the local Arab populations, country, and the broader Islamic world. So for many, many decades, the foreign policy of Israel was based on being a powerful fortress in the midst of a hostile region, and the ability to maintain itself as this powerful fortress depended on getting Western and sometimes Soviet help. But I think what we're seeing is that America's disengagement from the Middle East is turning Israel more away from this fortress idea into how can we integrate and ultimately secure our presence in the Middle East by hopefully having a less hostile Arab and Islamic presence. Because this is the one thing we will never be able to change. As long as there is such a thing as an Arab and Islamic identity, the Jews are destined to be a minority in the region. One of my favorite figures to sometimes discuss is that when Israel is established in 1948, the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region is 1 to 50, 50. So what do the Jews do? We ask for Jews to immigrate, right? So that we can beef up our numbers, and that's a great success. Over 3 million Jews made Aliyah, immigrated to Israel over the next decades. We make a lot of babies. Israel is the most fertile OECD country. So great, we are more than 10 times our numbers as Jews in our country. You know the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region today? 1 to 60, 60. So they've been busy too. They've been making babies too. So this is a given. We will never change this one fundamental fact of our existence as an ethnic, religious, national, cultural minority in an Arab and Islamic Middle East, which means that our future depends on those relationships. And I think the last year has been truly a breakthrough year. And much of what we're looking at in terms of the Biden administration and the big changes that are happening is, will they understand it and help promote it? Because for about a century, the contours of the conflict were actually pretty simple. It was a century-long mutual battle of exhaustion, in which each side was basically trying to exhaust the other side into giving up on their goal. The Arab side, initially through wars and diplomacy and legal warfare and terrorism, and of course, economic boycotts and battling against Israel in various international forums, tried to exhaust the Jewish people into giving up their claim to a sovereign state in the region. And they tried very hard and have failed. The Jewish side has been trying to exhaust the Arab world into finally accepting us. And this has been the mutual battle of exhaustion. And I think in many ways, the last year has been a breakthrough in this battle. It's true that we had very important peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan in the past, but they are better understood not as peace agreements, but as mutual non-aggression pacts. As I'm sure you know, there was not a lot of peacefulness about them. Jordan and Egypt continued to be at the forefront of anti-Israel resolutions and initiatives in various foreign and international bodies. There are barely diplomatic relations. Egyptians and Jordanian officials do not come to Israel, not to speak, there's no tourism, no cultural exchange. For many years, Israeli Jews were being accustomed to a very low bar of what peace is. And then come the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords are part of how the Trump administration saw itself leaving the Middle East. The agreement with Iran was how the Obama administration saw itself leaving the Middle East. The Abraham Accords were how the Trump administration saw America leaving the Middle East, but they're still leaving. And the amazing thing about the Abraham Accords is that they're not cold. They are very warm. And what they are showing us is they are showing us the light at the end of the tunnel of this century-long battle of mutual exhaustion. Because they are showing finally an Arab and Islamic willingness to accept Israel and sovereign Jews as indigenous in this region. And this is amazing. I know a lot of people tried to kind of minimize the importance of the Abraham Accords. Oh, they're just arms deals. And, you know, there was never an active war between Israel and the Emirates. You know, I think people have their purposes for trying to minimize this, but objectively, this is a huge breakthrough because it's not just the agreements themselves. The Emirates presents itself as the future of the Arab world. For a decade now, this is where young Arabs choose as their #1 destination to go work. The gleaming skyscrapers, the space programs, the international universities and museums, the Emirates is saying, this is what the Arab future looks like. And the Arab future, from their perspective, includes acceptance and warm embrace of Israel. So much so that I was even able to pen an op-ed with Emiratis, a woman and a man, and together we wrote an op-ed in which they proclaimed themselves as proud Arabs and Muslims Zionists. They're saying that they see no contradiction between being an Arab and a proud Muslim and a Zionist. And in fact, if anything, they're associating anti-Zionism with the past. An Arab embrace of Zionism is the future. Arab anti-Zionism is the past. They speak of it as like this Nasserist fixation from the past. And of course, the tragedy and the irony is at the moment that there are now strong, proud voices in the Arab and Muslim Middle East who are embracing Zionism, we have the rise of left-wing anti-Zionism as this new idea defining the left. And much of what we're saying, and the fear, I think, regardless the Biden administration, is the battle within the Democratic Party between the old elites, what you would call the liberal kind of old elites, Biden, Harris, that are also generally pro-Israel, friends of Israel, supporters, of course, of peace and a two-state solution, but very great supporters of Israel and Zionism, and those that are no longer at the margins of the Democratic Party, for whom anti-Zionism is now an article of faith of what it means to be a good Democrat or a good progressive. And I think this battle is going to define and be constantly an element of the Biden foreign policy. And I must say, for me, this is sad in many ways, because whatever Americans have to say about Trump domestically as a president, when it comes to the Middle East, he got it right. And I know it's become nearly impossible to say that, to speak of the Trump administration policies, foreign policies, and to speak about them in a rational manner that actually just looks at the policies. We find ourselves in a way falling victim to insane American partisanship, where if one person says this, if this was the policy of the Trump administration, then the Biden administration looks to undo all of it. Things such as they seem to be gung-ho on bringing funding back to UNRWA, even though there's nothing that could be more anti-peace and more against their hope of achieving a two-state solution than consciously and actively refunding an organization that is committed to undoing Israel as the sovereign state of the Jewish people. So I think Israelis, to the extent that they're watching American foreign policy, this is the battle that we're going to be watching. What policies of the Trump administration are going to be rolled back, how this battle between the progressive part and the liberal part of the Democratic Party is going to play out, anti-Zionism versus Zionism in the Biden administration. They're going to define it going forward. And of course, the irony is Adi and I, my co-writer for my co-author for The Right of Return, we are constantly WhatsApping. And recently, for example, the Emirates and Bahrain announced that they were cutting whatever funding they were giving to UNRWA in recent years for specific projects. And I told Adi, I said, look, this is amazing. The Arab world, or at least part of it, gets it. They get that funding UNRWA is an anti-Israel, anti-peace move, and the Democratic Party in the US doesn't get it. And I think we're going to see more and more of this separation, of this disconnect, of Israel relying more on local Arab allies as America is disengaging from the Middle East. As we are discussing the endless Israeli elections and our own version of the global crisis, there's no doubt that the one person who really saw it, took advantage of it and promoted it was Benjamin Netanyahu, which is why when people in the West seem to not understand his longevity as a leader, they never seem to have a problem with Merkel, by the way, who is more, but they have problems with Netanyahu, with his longevity as a leader, somehow thinking, mistaking his deep baritone for war-mongering policies, even though you would be hard-pressed to find a more cautious Israeli leader. He understood the changing geopolitics, the fact that America is getting out of the region, and that Israel ultimately has to build its future in alliance with Arab and Muslim countries. And you're even seeing it in those elections and reaching out to Israel's Arab and Muslim citizens and telling them that they have a home and they have and that they can vote for the Likud and for someone like Netanyahu. So both in terms of Israel foreign policy and external relations, and both in terms of Israel domestic issues, we're seeing a complete or a substantial realignment of Israel into the region, and an understanding that our future ultimately lies in being accepted and embraced by the broader Arab and Muslim world as the United States is disengaging from the Middle East and pivoting to Asia. So let me use that as opening remarks, and I'll be more than happy to discuss any issues.
Thank you, Einat. That was a very enlightening opening, and we're looking forward to the question and answers. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to facilitate the question and answers tonight, we'll be using the raised hand feature inside Zoom. For those that do not know how to access it, you can see the participant tab at the bottom of your screen if you're using a desktop computer, or at the top right-hand corner of your screen if you're using a mobile device. At the bottom of the list of the participants, you'll see a little icon that allows you to raise your hand. That will give me a silent indication of your intent to ask another question, and we will control everything from your camera and your microphone. You don't need to worry about that. So to get things started, I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Dr. Svi Fleischer.
Thank you, Einat. Just following up on your statements about UNRWA, the Biden administration, of course, is saying they're going to refund UNRWA and they're going to rejoin the UN Human Rights Council, even while admitting that the Human Rights Council at least is deeply flawed. They say they're going to try and reform the Human Rights Council. Do you think that's possible? And is there any hope to the U.S. Can the U.S. do anything in positive in UNRWA, or is the complete organization just completely beyond the pale and needs to be removed?
So one of the most concerning issues, and I'm totally working on it and reaching out to people, and I mean, it feels like a done deal, but trying to do everything perhaps either to prevent it or to change it. And this is precisely the thing I'm trying to figure out. If they are intent on refunding UNRWA, can anything be done? So first of all, I have to say it is a sad affair that they are so intent. I mean, they literally seem gung-ho to do it. And if America's funding of UNRWA for decades could be attributed to dumb inertia, okay? In the book, we describe how UNRWA in the beginning in the 1950s had good intentions, how it was hijacked very quickly by the Arab and Palestinian cause of maintaining themselves as perpetual refugees in the hope of undoing 1948 and undoing Israel's existence. But the West kept paying because it had a lot of other concerns, and it didn't want to anger the Arabs and was concerned about Arabs and Palestinians going to the Soviet side, and oil was important. All of the things that are no longer relevant. The Cold War, oil is losing. So the geopolitical reasons that led the West to fund UNRWA and to do so for decades did not exist. And this is what did not exist anymore in recent years. And this is what the Trump administration understood, and they defunded UNRWA with no consequences. Now, to refund UNRWA now is a conscious choice. It's no longer this dumb inertia. It means that America is taking an active position to saying, we support this organization. To rejoin the UN Human Rights Council, as I like to say, the Orwellian named UN Human Rights Council, because literally no word there is true, to rejoin it is to make an active statement. It's not about inertia. It's to say, on balance, we think being in this organization is better than being out of it. On balance, we're willing to lend American legitimacy to this organization, which is why it's so devastating, because this is now an active, conscious statement to support these organizations on behalf of the United States. And as of now, I can tell you, they're not really making an effort to say that they will rejoin to reform. It feels like lip service. I have not heard anything from that side that shows that they understand how destructive UNRWA is, that shows that they understand how the UN Human Rights Council is used and abused to give cover to anti-Israel resolutions. I'm sure many of you follow Hillel Neuer from UN Watch. Hillel always likes to publish the numbers of how many anti-Israel resolutions there are compared to any resolutions on any other country. And the numbers are clearly off the charts. But once Hillel told me something that I thought was even more interesting than the numbers. He said that in the UN Human Rights Council, when they say, let's say they decide to censor Sudan, he said the resolution always looks like this. It has a lot of caveats. It says things like, we really appreciate the efforts that Sudan has been making to improve its human rights records, blah, 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 blah. And it could do better. But they always try, they cover it with a lot of praise. Israel is the only country that is condemned in no uncertain terms. It's always clear, it's dark, it's black, it's evil. Israel has done. And so it's not just that the numbers are off the charts, it's that the language is always language of evil. Israel cannot do, there's nothing that Israel does that is considered to be a mitigating circumstance, nothing. So by America going back to these organizations, refunding UNRWA, it would be making a conscious, active statement, which is terrible. And I haven't seen anything that shows that they understand. If they understood, they could do things. They could say things like, we're refunding UNRWA, but we are also doing it with a clear declaration that UNRWA's recipients of services are not refugees. We want to make it clear that citizens of Jordan and people who live in the West Bank and Gaza cannot be considered refugees by any international standards. They could be refunding UNRWA and making those declarations. They could be saying, we are refunding UNRWA with a 5-year plan for dismantling the organization. This is an interim process. They could do these things, but I see zero indication that this is how they want to do it. They are actually interested in demonstrating what is now called virtue signaling, that they are the anti-Trump and that they are overhauling its policies regardless of whether they were good ones or bad ones.
Thank you, Einat. Now, I just want to confirm, it appears as though that in a Zoom update, the raise hand feature has moved. So it is down the bottom of your screen. There is a tab that says reactions. If you click that reaction, there's a few options there, one of which is the raised hand feature. My apologies for that. So the raised hand feature has moved. It's at a tab called reactions down the bottom of your screen, and hopefully you can find it there. Anyone that has an issue, go into the chat and we'll give you personalized instructions from there. I'd now like to hand over to Ajax Naomi Levine. Naomi, unmute. Beautiful.
Sorry, don't know what went on then. Thank you very much, Einat. And I just wanted to point out that since we spoke last, or since you spoke last to AIJAC, Australia has actually cut its contribution to UNRWA in half. And I think that needs to just be stated. And I think it's in no small part due to your research that you've been presenting and that we at AIJAC have been able to share. So thank you very much. I wanted to move on to the International Criminal Court decision that came down a couple of days ago. The ICC, for those who haven't kept up, has just determined that it can prosecute Israel for war crimes on the basis of a complaint from the so-called State of Palestine. I wanted to hear from you what you think the danger of this process is to Israel and what Israel can be doing in response.
So here, of course, the United States is supporting Israel because it's in its own interest. America also doesn't want, for its own reasons, to give the ICC any legitimacy. This is, of course, on one level, a worrying trend, even though I can tell you that it didn't get much attention here in Israel, because it, as far as Israelis view it, it slumped in with the general sense that international bodies are anti-Israel and that international bodies are corrupted by their anti-Israel obsession. And that therefore it's kind of considered part of this so what's new under the sun piece of news. I know that the people who are working on it are worried by the implications, especially since at the end of the day, people who get prosecuted are individuals. It's not about a country, it's ultimately about individuals. And I think in that sense, there is concern. I sense that have nothing to do with the legal aspects here. I personally always appreciate when international bodies say that Palestine is a state, because it gives me opportunity to push the consequences and implications of that. Because one of the things we've seen, for example, in this last year with Israel successfully vaccinating its citizens is, of course, immediately the effort to say, okay, since we cannot just sit back and have Israel succeed at something, let's immediately find out what's the sinister element lurking underneath. And then you had the beginning of the libel of the, okay, but Israel is, while vaccinating its own, it's actively preventing Palestinians, rejecting its responsibility and not vaccinating them. Now, and one of the amusing comments that I saw throughout this whole affair is that someone said, you do realize that for Israel to vaccinate now the Palestinians in Gaza, it would have to invade Gaza, enter it, and then forcefully vaccinate Palestinians, kind of just reminding people how absurd the whole notion is. And it's part of a long trend. And I tweeted about it, you know, when Israel opened the first field hospital in Haiti, immediately what came was the libel that Israel was using it to harvest organs. And in general, you see it whenever there's something that kind of is an Israeli success. So, and by the way, at the beginning, the Palestinians didn't know what anyone wanted from them. I mean, the Palestinian Authority even initially started saying, look, it's not Israel's responsibility, it's our responsibility. We've been responsible for our healthcare since Oslo. We are in the process of procuring vaccines from China, from Russia. So the amazing thing is that it was not about Israelis and Palestinians. This is where we go again. This is now about especially domestic American and Western issues and virtue signaling in every direction. But what is amazing, and someone also pointed that out, is that you see an amazing correlation between the people who say that it's Israel's responsibility to do things for Palestinians and those who claim that Palestine is a state, right? And they're able to hold these two contradictory thoughts in their mind. On the one hand, they push Palestine as a state when it's useful against Israel, and they ignore or they push back on the notion that Palestine is a state when it's inconvenient for libeling Israel. But that's why I generally like it when people that say that Palestine is a state and even an international body like the ICC, because then it's easier for me to push the absurdity, for example, of my pet topic of the refugees. If Palestine is a state, please do enlighten me. How is it that a person who was born in Ramallah, in the state of Palestine, lived in Ramallah all their lives, has never been displaced by war, is by magic a refugee from Palestine? In what world is that possible that you were born and living in your own state, but you're a refugee from another place, which is also magically called Palestine? Why are they refugee camps? No, they're not camps by now, of course, they're neighborhoods, but why are they refugee neighborhoods or refugee cities inside Palestine, inside the state of Palestine? So personally, I like it just to use it mostly for rhetorical reasons, to push people on the fact that they like to say that Palestine is a state when it's good against Israel, and they don't like to say that Palestine is a state when that's not helpful for them to be against Israel. But that is kind of the contradiction that we live in, that is not about rationality and not about reason and not about accepting the full repercussions and consequences of what it means to say that Palestine is a state. And I wanted to add, of course, that yes, we received with tremendous pleasure to see that Australia was cutting the assistance in half. And again, one of the things that we're sad about is that if the Biden administration refunds UNRWA without any effort to balance it, then it leaves a country like Australia, which took this important step, alone. And, I think it's the wrong thing to do.
Thank you, Einat, for that. What a fabulous answer. Now, I'd like to hand over for the next question to Evan Charlton.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Wilf, for all of your enlightening views. You mentioned the US pivot to Asia, and I want to ask you a question, and you touched on it, is an Israeli pivot to the Arab world. Can you please unbundle and comment on the new dynamic emerging whereby Prime Minister Netanyahu is actively courting the Arab vote through local mayors and is steadily building an alliance with Mansour Abbas, who I think traditionally has quite an Islamic oriented and anti-Zionist political agenda. These seem to be people from polar apart. And we know Netanyahu historically has manipulated the threat of Arab voters to motivate his Likud supporters remember they were wearing cameras into some polling booths last election. And prior to that, he had this late announcement about the Arabs are busing to the polling booths, everyone get out so they don't steamroll us. So it seems quite a fascinating dynamic. And I just wonder if you can unbundle and unpick that for us, please.
Certainly. Netanyahu, in many respects, is a very capable and therefore very cynical politician. But sometimes his cynicism might have the effect, intended or unintended, of a long-term positive legacy. I think one day, one of the positive legacies of Netanyahu will actually be not what people think of as his divisiveness, but actually the fact that he brought in many more voices into the Israeli mainstream through his various manipulations and cynicism. So you're absolutely right that what has happened in the last couple of years is that Netanyahu has no longer wanted to be simply prime minister. If Netanyahu had only tried to be prime minister, which means to get 61 votes out of 120 member parliament, he would have had his government 2 years ago, and we would not have been going through these series of repeated elections. The problem is that this is not what Netanyahu wanted anymore. Because Netanyahu has been indicted and going through a process of criminal charges for corruptions, for bribery, for breaching the public trust, he is determined to get 61 votes, not merely for being prime minister, but for a combination of legislation that will allow him to evade this legal proceedings. So he's not just needing 61 votes to be prime minister, which he handily had. He was trying to get 61 votes for major legislative changes. And for that, he didn't have, at no point was he able to get 61 votes for that, which is why he has taken every opportunity to try to go to repeated elections. In many ways, like the gambler throwing the dice again and again in the hope that at one point the dice will show 61 votes for literally get out of jail card. And that's what he's been trying to do. And in his desperation to get those 61 votes for legislative change, he is looking everywhere, including to long neglected Israel's Arab citizens and especially Israel's Arab parties. And Netanyahu, you know, he's a charming man. When he decides to court someone, generally almost no one can withstand him, because he has this combination of utter cynicism. So he will promise you anything, and charm, and you want to believe him because he's a serious man. And literally, you know, Israeli politics is strewn with bodies of people who were charmed into believing him. And right now, the people who are kind of the object of his courtship are Israel's Arab citizens and the Arab parties, and he's bringing it together with his openness to the Arab world, the warming relations with the Gulf countries, and he's putting it together. I mean, you can see it in his courtship. He says, why can't we be like Dubai? You know, there's no reason for Israel not to be this place of openness, tolerance, Jews and Arabs living together. He came out with a very interesting ad using the word one people, Am Echad, the Hebrew word Am, people, nation, one people, but showing a lot of Arabs and Muslims in this video. And generally in Israel, the notion of people and nation is Jews and Arabs. There's the Jewish people and the Arab people, the Jewish nation, the Arab nation. To say what Am Echad and then to show Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims is rare and new. And Netanyahu is the one doing it, not some very, very marginal left-wing party. So even though everyone knows this is entirely cynical, I think it might have a lasting legacy. And you're right, in his utter cynicism and desire to get those 61 votes for legislative change, he will go to the most extreme right-wing parties and the most extreme Arab, Islamist, anti-gay parties and bring them in. So we're seeing some very, I mean, the whole breakdown of Israeli politics, left and right, and Jews and Arabs, all of that is really changing. And despite all the cynicism that's underneath it, I think it might have a very interesting, lasting legacy.
Thank you, Einat. I'll now hand over to Ajax Sharon Middleman.
Thanks, Einat. Just following up on that, what do you think Netanyahu's prospects are for becoming Prime Minister again? And how do you think the COVID situation will impact the election?
So first of all, it's become a well-known saying that no one has made money betting against Netanyahu. So everyone is very careful. There are several scenarios. First of all, in one of the most interesting, perfect alignments of the personal and the public, Netanyahu was overheard in a Zoom video a couple weeks ago saying, when the virus goes up, my mandates, I mean, the polls for me go down, and when the virus goes down, the polls go up. So a lot of people thought, oh, this is a terrible thing to say, how cynical. And I thought, this is actually wonderful. You have a perfect alignment here where the personal desire of Netanyahu to rise in the polls, he understands that it entirely depends on the way that he handles the virus. Because he's basically looking around the world. He's looking at New Zealand on the one hand, and he's looking at the US on the other. And he's saying, okay, in both those cases, how those countries handled the virus immediately translated into the political fates of the leaders. And he understands that it's the same for his own. And he found himself, he pushed himself, he put everything into the vaccination drive, which really is successful. And he's lucky in the sense that the vaccines are showing better data, both in terms of probably reducing infection, as well as reducing the more intense levels of sickness, as well as being effective. Pfizer just announced today being effective against the British and South Africa mutations. But Israel has also seen a massive spike in the number of people having the virus, but fewer of them are sick. So there's this sense of like insanity. A friend of mine said, why does everything in Israel have to be so extreme? We're number one in the charts on the vaccination. We're number one in the charts in the number of people who have the virus. Can we just have like a nice middle? But a lot for Netanyahu depends whether by the time we reach the end of March, will the vaccination drive beat out the number of people who are critically ill, which means the number of people who are at the hospital, so that life can go back to normal and he will be able to declare, and this is the thing he wants to declare more than anything, that Israel is the first country to beat the virus by vaccination. You know, there are countries like New Zealand and Australia and China and Taiwan and Korea who have beat the virus by policy. But Netanyahu wants to at least have Israel as being the first to beat the virus through mass vaccination drive. He might still get it. And he believes that if he'll be able to declare it on March 22nd, on the eve of elections, he will be very, very high in the polls. And that's a possibility, which we cannot discount. And I can tell you, no one is watching the numbers of the virus and the vaccine more closely than Netanyahu.
Thank you, Einat. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Ran Porat.
Hello, Einat. Hi. It's a pleasure to have you here as well, and a very interesting, fascinating discussion so far. I want to ask you about the changing policies of the upcoming, or the Biden administration. What we see vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia already and other nations is a shift from conflict resolution during Kerry's time, Obama, to conflict management, a specific focus on human rights. Is this the way the approach of the Biden administration is going to be from now on towards the Palestinian issue, and what are the implications of such a shift?
So I think what we're going to see from the Biden administration is going to be a lot of ambivalence, a lot of contradictions that will reflect this battle between the progressive side of the Democratic Party and the traditional elite liberal side. We saw just today or yesterday in Secretary Blinken's declaration regarding the Golan Heights, saying that they're kind of like putting a question mark on the legality of America's recognition of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, but on the practicality saying, look, we're not going to challenge it because as long as Assad and Syria are a mess, of course, Israel has to stay on the Golan Heights. So this kind of convoluted, ambivalent, paradoxical message is, I think, going to become the template of the Biden administration, kind of saying, virtue signaling to the progressive side, we're not endorsing the legality of it, but then talking to the more traditional foreign policy side saying, but we're not going to challenge Israel's presence in the Golan Heights anytime soon. So I think those are the kind of messages we're going to have to get used to, which is going to be, I think, maddening. So the same with the Palestinians. I think you're going to see doing a lot of steps like refunding UNRWA, refunding the PA, finding a way again around the Taylor Force Act, kind of making it, turning it into another budgetary element, but not really changing anything on the ground, which again is crazy. When people say, okay, we want to give money to the Palestinian Authority, but the Taylor Force Act, which prevents us by legislation of giving money as long as the PA does what's called pay to slay, gives money to families of terrorists based on a sliding scale of how many Israelis they killed. So what you see the Biden administration is trying to find their way around it by recasting the budget item on the Palestinian side away from money to terrorists to, I don't know, some social services item. But they're not challenging the issue. They're not challenging the Palestinian Authority on the ethos that terrorists are the heroes of Palestinians and therefore should be paid for and cared for as the heroes of the Palestinian cause. No one even thinks of challenging that. Same with UNRWA. No one thinks of challenging this perpetual refugeedom, this demand to settle inside Israel and to undo the Jewish state. They're not even thinking of challenging that. They just want to take steps to give the money, but then are they going to pursue negotiations? I'm not sure. I'm not sure they're going to make much of an effort in that direction. So I think we're going to see a lot of this ambivalence of kind of doing enough to placate or please the progressive side, but then not really doing anything that upends any big issues. And you know, I think it's we're in for a fairly disappointing several years.
I'm unmuted there. Thank you, Einat. Now that will give, that actually leads in, I'm going to give you 3 very quick fire emailed questions that I've received from the audience, 2 of which have come from our friends over the Tasman in New Zealand. So hello, a special hello to all of our New Zealand audience members who have been able to join us tonight. Now they do jump around a bit. One is the tail on to your last answer. And in terms of the Biden administration with the Iran issue, we recently saw Lieutenant General Avi Kochavi come out and say that Israel will do whatever it needs to do to halt Iran's nuclear program, make sure that they do not obtain the bomb. So this questioner is asking whether or not if Israel cannot find a reliable ally in the Biden administration to assist in its efforts to stymie Iran's bomb, can Israel turn to any other player in the region or in the broader area to assist in ensuring that Iran doesn't get the bomb?
So as America disengages and leaves the Middle East, basically there's 2 opposing policies. Either America disengages by making Iran its central ally or future ally, or it disengages by making the Gulf its basis. This is it. And in that sense, it's almost a zero-sum game. Either like you go like the Obama administration and put your emphasis on Iran, or you go with the Trump administration and you put your emphasis on the Gulf, and that also includes the Gulf plus Israel. But that's pretty much it. And right now, the indications from the Biden administration, whether it is with respect to Saudi and Yemen, or the going back to the agreement with Iran, is that they are more likely to pursue the idea that America disengages from the Middle East by placing its bets on Iran or on moderating Iran. And I think we're going to see a lot of back and forth, and you know, we're not in the same place that we were a few years ago. And again, you're seeing all these opposing statements. Yes, they want to get back to the agreements. No, they're not removing sanctions. So I think we're going to see from this administration a lot more of muddling, which means on the good side, I don't think we're likely to see the kind of clashes that we saw with the Obama administration, but we're also not likely to see the breakthroughs that we saw with the Trump administration. I think it's going to be much more of a muddling through, finding kind of places that don't go in any direction one way or another, do not stake a clear position one way or another. So I think Israel will try to make the most of that. It will try to get from America as much as possible, which is going to be less than what it got from the previous administration, but probably more than it got from the Obama administration on this issue. And I think enhance its relationship with the Gulf countries. Israel has been under Netanyahu placing greater emphasis on its close relationships with India, with China. What you're going to see is Israel having more and more a diversified foreign policy in which relying on America is but one element. In some ways, I think you could think of the Israeli relationship to the Trump administration as a kind of grab everything you can before it's over. Try to secure as many advances, as many wins for Israel before, not just before the Trump administration is over, but before America fully leaves the Middle East. Try to do everything to secure Israel's position. And I think now what we're going to see is an Israel that works with America and with Europe and with India and with China, and of course, a lot more openly with the Gulf countries and with Egypt and generally with the Arab and Islamic world. And it's just going to be a much more diverse and put eggs in many baskets foreign policy.
Thank you for that. Now I will go to hand over to Judy. I will get back to the email questions if time permits, but I think I'll go to those that have raised their hands inside the Zoom session. So I'll hand over to Ajax, Judy Maynard.
Thank you. There's a question in chat from Ida Lichter, which I'll read out. How concerned should Israel be about Biden's appointments of Robert Malley as the envoy on Iran and Mahebita as the Senior Director for Intelligence at the National Security Council? And you've mentioned Tony Blinken. You might like to add your views as well, if there's time, on his appointment as Secretary of State and Wendy Sherman as Deputy.
So I think in the appointments, we're seeing the appointments reflect this ambivalence, this paradox, this kind of trying to work with both sides of the Democratic Party. I think by and large, when you take the appointments as a whole, they demonstrate generally to be in the camp of the old elites on that side. But there are certain appointments that also signal to the progressive side. And you're right that some of these appointments are more on the Iran side. But again, it's difficult to say how this will play out because I think this will become a theme of the administration. Just the constant ambivalence, the constant back and forth. They might appoint Rob Malley on Iran, which signals a more conciliatory approach, but then they're also saying that they're not immediately lifting sanctions. So that's a less conciliatory approach. And I think that's what you're going to see. The appointments are part of that. The way that Secretary Blinken behaves is part of it. We're going to have a lot of this back and forth, which I think is going to leave a lot of people frustrated. Perhaps not just in the Middle East. I can say less about their appointments on other issues, but I think there's going to be a lot of this frustration that there's no staking out of any clear position in any direction. And the appointments are a part of that. We have a mixed bag of appointments that, again, do not signal one clear direction. It signals this constant muddling through. And I think that's what we're in for a while.
Thank you, Einat. Now I'll hand over to Anthony Colin for the final question from the audience before handing over to Jeremy Jones for the final question.
Thank you, Einat, for your clear thinking. In the future, 2/3 of the world's population in the Indian subcontinent and East Asia region is going to be using the Indian Ocean as one of the major trade routes of the world. How do you figure the relationship between Israel and India will evolve because of this? And is India going to be the new big boy in the area?
So India has clearly transformed in many ways. The trajectory of Israel's relationship with India is a bit the trajectory of its relationship with the Gulf countries. I remember when I visited India, still as a member of parliament, about, I think, 10 years ago. It was before Modi was elected, but it was already clear that his party is gaining strength. And I remember meeting many Indian officials and seeing their love for Israel, their admiration for Israel. And, you know, for many years, there was this description that Israel's relationship with India is like that of a mistress. So it's close, it's passionate, but it's not out in the open. And I remember coming back from this trip and saying, I think it's time to put a ring on it. So there was a sense that the Indians are definitely ready for a warm, open relation with Israel, and that they're no longer concerned about what the Muslim minority will say if India has warmer relations with Israel. And we've seen the same trajectory with the Gulf countries, having a very strong relationship on intelligence, on arms, on security issues for many years, but under the radar. And then suddenly a sense that you can go out into the open with it. And when you go out to the open, it becomes very warm. And that's what we've seen with India, and that's what we've seen with the Gulf states. So I don't think for a while we're going to see a big boy. I mean, China and America will continue to be prominent. India will have more prominence, even though it has its own issues. But I think what you're going to see, and again, Netanyahu got it fairly early on, is that Israel will no longer be able to have this rely only on America foreign policy that sustained it for so long, basically since the Yom Kippur War till kind of the present. Israel will have to diversify its foreign policy, still heavily relying on America, but and some Europe, but much more. You've already seen it: Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Gulf, India, China, and also working with a lot of other smaller countries, working with countries in Africa and Latin America, of course, with Australia, with Japan. I mean, you're seeing Israel understanding that its future depends really on having a lot of eggs in many baskets. And India is certainly one of the bigger baskets, but it will not replace America. China will not replace America, certainly not from the Israeli perspective. It will be just one more of the elements that Israel plays in trying to secure its future in the region and work with all these countries.
Thank you. Now I hand over to Jeremy Jones for the final question for tonight.
Thank you. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because there's a question in chat as well as my question. The question in chat that everybody wants to know is, when do you think Israel might have open borders again to Australians, New Zealanders, etc., who desperately want to come back? That's the question from the audience, and everybody wants to know the answer. The other question, though, is Australia. What can the Australian government be doing constructively at the moment to help the positive developments as you see them, and hopefully frustrate some of the people who have negative intent?
So, like I said, opening the borders will depend in large part on the whole vaccination thing. We've just signed an agreement with Greece that people who can show that they've been fully vaccinated, so that they got their 2 Pfizer shots, will be able to travel to Greece without any need to quarantine, not in Greece, not in Israel when they come back. They will not need to do any tests. The idea is, of course, to expand it. And I think the more countries will be able to expand it to, we will open the skies. I know Australia is doing something similar with New Zealand. Hopefully, if Israel can show that a large share of its population is vaccinated, it will be able to open the skies to other countries that have handled the virus well, either through policy or vaccination. I know some people are doing a little, they're thinking, there've been initiatives after Israel's population will be mostly vaccinated about having a Jew, for Jews, come to Israel and vaccinate yourselves, stay for 3 weeks kind of packages. So there's ideas for that. Who knows? But that's hopefully in the next month, I think we'll have a better handle on how this is developing. And finally, on the question, remind me, I've been into the, what was the last question? Oh, Australia.
Yeah,
Okay,
sorry.
got it. Yes, sorry, remember. So personally, I think Australia finds itself in a very important position with respect to foreign policy. It's a strong, reliable, long-term ally of the US, of Western Europe, of Europe. It's a country that people look at as a country that they can rely on. And at the same time, Australia has been very smart about, obviously, I mean, Australia doesn't have to pivot much, but to establish its relationship with the East, with India, with China, as per the previous question, with, of course, its neighbor, with New Zealand, the Pacific foreign policy. So Australia finds itself in a position where it can actually strengthen the part of the Biden administration that from our perspective is pro-Israel, Zionist, wants to promote peace that is based on Israel existing rather than peace based on Israel disappearing, which is what refunding UNRWA means. So it can definitely lend its voice to those developments. And I think definitely what's been happening in the region in recent years is making it easy. I think it's far easier to come out in support of Israel when you have a vision of peace, such as the Abraham Accords, and say, look, we understand that peace depends on Israel being strong and on Arab and Islamic countries embracing Israel as indigenous. It's possible to promote a vision of peace where there is a Palestinian state next to Israel rather than instead of Israel. I think those are messages that Australia really, as a strong ally that has excellent relationships with pretty much the entire world, is very much in a position to do. And I think, for example, even on UNRWA, if Australia were able to send a message to the US to say, hey, you can't leave us alone here. The Emiratis, the Bahrainis have cut their funding. We have cut our funding. You can't just go and refund UNRWA and that be considered not a disastrous policy. So I think Australia is very much in the position to say these things. The UNHRC, the UN was the Zionism is racism. Australia led the charge to annul Zionism as racism. Australia knows a lot about abusing international bodies that actually corrupt those bodies and their ability to pursue important goals. I think this is certainly a message that Australia can carry. And you guys are at the forefront of it. I always say everywhere that in terms of, I think, dollar for dollar, I think AIJAC is by far the most effective organization. So I want to thank you for all that you do.
Well, thank you very much for that, Einat. It's a lovely way to end tonight's webinar. Not only would I like to thank, on behalf of AIJAC, like to thank you for such a wonderful presentation tonight, but you are our first webinar for this year and our first repeat presenter for our webinar. So that just shows you how highly we think of you here at AIJAC. And the audience tonight was definitely treated to a brilliant presentation. And thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is here, The War of Return. Please follow the link in the chat to purchase your own copy, or you can contact us in the AIJAC Melbourne office. We have some copies available for you. Now, next week, our next webinar, just a reminder, is next Wednesday, the 17th of February at noon with Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, Danielle Pletka. So please look out for your reminder email, which will come out towards the end of the week. For now, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next week.